Hi, this is Kallina, and in this video we'll go over the motion for round 4 of the 2022 World Schools Debate League Asia, with a few ideas and suggestions on how to approach prep from both prop and op on this motion. So the motion reads, this House would allow political parties to designate some of their electoral promises as binding. Once in government, breaking those promises would immediately trigger a new election. Just a quick disclaimer here. Obviously, everything I say in this video are ideas and suggestions. It's not the only way to approach this motion, nor is it an exhaustive list of arguments for this debate, right? There's no one correct argument or one correct case that you can run in this debate or in any debate. It all really depends, as ever, in your strategic choices that you make with your teams and the ideas that you have and the way that you think is most effective for you. So these are just guidelines for this motion rather than everything or the correct way to do this, just things that might help. So firstly, in terms of understanding the debate and accessing the motion effectively, we need to look a bit at definitions and how to understand the burdens imposed by this motion and the words that we need to look at. The first thing here is to look at this as a policy debate, right? This is actually putting something in practice. And as with any policy debate, you can find sort of the burden that you need to meet with this debate often in the verb. So words like banning, legalizing, invading, right? So these kind of words are a hint at the policy you need to defend and how strongly you need to defend this happening. The motion here says that it would allow political parties to make such promises. This means that they have a choice if they want to do this and which policies they want to do it for, right? You're not making it mandatory and saying that this should always happen, but rather the burden in this debate is to say that this is something that can happen. This has some implications for both proposition and opposition in this debate. For proposition, it means that they need to defend that there are instances in which this should happen, right? Just because it's allowing it to happen, like allowing something that you never plan on doing, is not really something that is worth debating, right? So if proposition says that this should be allowed, there's a reasonable expectation that political parties would do this on some occasions, and proposition therefore needs to defend that there are instances in which this should happen, that it would be a good thing for political parties to do this. And secondly, it also needs to argue that it would happen in those instances, right? Proposition effectively takes on a burden to show that allowing political parties to make this choice will, in most cases, at least in the majority of cases, lead to political parties making the choice to make the electoral promises that proposition wants to focus on, right? Otherwise, if you're saying that it would be good if it happens in cases, say, of very important fiscal policy decisions, but ultimately you don't show that political parties would make these kind of promises binding, but rather would make binding promises about something else, like more minor or less important policies, then you have a mismatch between when you think it should happen and when it will happen, and therefore you're not meeting the burden of showing why this should be allowed, why it's a good idea, right? So proposition needs to do both. Secondly, from the opposition's point of view, then, the fact that this is allowing political parties to make this decision means that opposition, again, has a bit of a strategic choice here. It could either argue that this should never happen, that political parties making binding promises that can trigger effectively a new election is always a bad idea, and there are no circumstances in which this would be a good idea. Or they can argue that they expect this to mostly be a bad idea, avoiding sort of a more absolute burden, saying that they expect this to mostly be a bad idea, and arguing that it is likely to be used in the wrong instances. So in this case, the opposition doesn't need to show, if they choose this, they don't need to show that this is always going to be a disaster, but rather that there are instances in which this would be very problematic, and that in many cases, these are the ones that political parties would end up gravitating to, right? So this opens this area of argumentation for the opposition in this debate. So ultimately, the fact that this is about allowing is telling us that both sides in this debate need to think about in which cases they think that having a binding electoral promise would be a positive thing if you're in proposition, or a negative thing if you're in opposition. And secondly, they both both teams need to think about when would these parties make this choice, right? This is true of all debates in which you are allowing for something to happen. You need to look at the actor specifically that will be making that choice based on the policy and think about who are they, why would they be making this choice, and when would they be making this choice. So the second thing then that this leads to is that for both teams, now that we've established this about a choice, that both teams need to think about which policies do they as a team want to support that this would happen for, right? There's here quite a lot of space for framing and characterizations in terms of the policies that you want to argue for. There are questions here that can lead you to think about this. So for example, when would political parties have an incentive to make a policy binding? What are the sort of things that political parties would think about when deciding which promises to make binding and which promises to just leave as pre-electoral promises or just a general party mandate that they're not making into such a binding promise in advance? Is it things, for example, that they are certain they can deliver on, right? I would expect from proposition to argue that there's a high level of certainty attached to the things that they would make binding promises, because obviously if it's something very speculative, you probably wouldn't make that promise. Or potentially things that you have done more research as a party on and you're quite certain that you can deliver. Or alternatively, is it things that maybe you're not so sure that you can actually deliver, but you know are very important to your electorate and to your support base, and therefore you know that if you lose their support, if you don't manage to deliver on this issue, it doesn't really matter if you stay in power, because you won't be able to effectively govern from that point onwards. You will have lost a very significant part of your voter base and the support that you have, right? So you need to think about what are the incentives here that the political parties could use. Notice that a lot of the things I'm talking about here could be used by the opposition as well, right? Because these could be positive or negative things. And we'll get to that a little bit later in terms of the argumentation, but just saying that these are things that you're very certain you can deliver on doesn't necessarily tell us which kind of promises these are for each individual party, but rather gives us a metric through which to decide which policies they would pick. For that. We'll get later on in terms of how this impacts on argumentation, but it's something you need to consider straight away from the beginning when setting up this debate in prep. The third thing here that you need to talk about, and I think both proposition and opposition need to think about straight away in terms of the setup of the debate and the context of the debate, and to identify the clashes, is to think of alternative safety checks that exist already, right? Does this happen already now in other indirect ways, or are there other ways in which you can support that this can happen? Do you stand for parties? Is the alternative to stand for parties staying in government until the end of their term necessarily? Or can you trigger new elections midterm in other ways, right? And I think here, for example, the most obvious thing is that in many parliamentary systems, there are options here to trigger an election through a vote of no confidence in parliament. If you have enough people within parliament and enough elected representatives that say that they need an election, that government has lost the faith of the rest of the parliament. You could even have this in some context through the citizens demanding it directly through citizen-initiated referenda, right? So there are alternatives here that don't require for the promise to be made in advance as binding, but rather while the government is already in power, to say, here, you've messed up or you haven't delivered enough, and we think we need to have a re-election, right? So I think there is an element in this debate of whether this is enough of a safety net and enough of a check on governments to make binding promises unnecessary, or to make it like a worse alternative, right? I think proposition here needs to argue that these are not enough of a safety net, that this can be possibly problematic, that the decision in those cases when you have the parliament deciding through a vote of no confidence to trigger elections, that this is problematic because the decision here is made by opposition parties. So the vote of no confidence can be either in the hands of specific MPs or in the opposition parties getting together and saying that we no longer support this government, right? So I think proposition can take issue here with who's the decision maker and argue that a system of binding promises before has both more transparency, but also gives the choice of what are these issues that you would ask for a re-election or a new election that it puts the power of that in the voters themselves to decide what are these issues and what party they want to support based on what is a binding promise. Whereas in the alternative, this power rests in the hands of other politicians and potentially politicizes the issue more, since this is something that they can try to do just because they want to overthrow the government and have another chance of becoming the governing party themselves, rather than something that the voters have indicated is a priority for them, right? So that you could argue this is less party political as a process. I think opposition can also argue on the flip side that this is a much better safety net, precisely because it happens after the elections, it happens in real time. It actually looks at what the government has and hasn't done in a much more holistic way, rather than isolating specific issues. It allows to factor in, for example, things that may have changed in terms of the context since the last election, right? So, for example, some pre-electoral promises may no longer be realistic or viable because the context has changed, and a system where the parliament gets to decide this is much more dynamic in nature and can reflect those changes better than pre-electoral promises can. Just think, for example, of how economic priorities or fiscal policies, etc., were affected massively during the COVID pandemic. Like, a lot of parties and a lot of governments had to radically change their priorities in ways that they did not expect to have to do at the point before when the elections happened in a lot of countries, right? So they didn't really foresee for that. And a system of these kind of binding promises may not be flexible to changes like that. COVID might be a bit of an extreme example, but obviously very often natural disasters or other issues, conflicts, etc., may arise that change the situation very drastically, right? So opposition could argue that the safety net is better because it's a much more dynamic model. So overall, in terms of setting up the debate and understanding the debate, I think it's important, just to recap, firstly, that you identify that this is about a choice, allowing a choice rather than mandating that this happens in every circumstance. So that secondly means that you need to have a clash in this debate about deciding which policies are parties likely to make binding, and is this a good or a bad thing? How can you pick ones that make sense to argue over from proposition and opposition? And thirdly, are there alternatives here? Where are you setting the comparative in terms of the options available, both to the voters, but to politicians as well, to respond to a government that is failing to deliver what's expected of them, right? So there needs to be that there to clarify the clash. Now, moving on in terms of the actual prep and how to come up with content for this debate, I think just basic, firstly, in terms of thinking of the stakeholders in this debate, I think the first group to consider is to look at the voters, right? And how does this affect their choices? From proposition, I think you can argue that potentially this creates more of a feeling of security for voters and trust in the politicians, knowing that they're willing to say, this is going to be binding, I'm willing to be put up for a vote again and to lose my position in government, to potentially risk losing my position in government if I fail to deliver on this promise, means that voters can have a much stronger sense of trust and security in those parties. And I think you can impact this, especially in a context of voters generally in many democracies being more disengaged, which is reflected in low turnouts in elections, that sense that the elections don't really matter, that you can't really necessarily trust politicians because they're all like words and no action. So I think proposition can do quite a lot with how voters will be affected, both in the party that they choose, but also in terms of their overall engagement with politics if they have more trust. I think you can also argue that this is quite indicative in terms of the party, that it actually creates more informed voters, because looking at which promise each party makes or which promises each party chooses to make binding, potentially also highlights that they're saying this is some of our core priorities. These are the things that we intend to deliver on no matter what. So this could be very important information about the party, especially in a world in which a lot of parties are, finding it hard to differentiate it from one another, where, instead of differentiating in terms of policy, they're differentiating in terms of rhetoric, and you have more polarization. This could be a situation in which they make policies binding and therefore differentiate themselves from each other in that way, rather than having to go to more extreme rhetoric, etc. So I think proposition has a lot here in terms of how this would affect voters and their choices. From opposition, I think, opposition can also talk about how this can lead to more disillusionment and flip that idea of trust and engagement by looking at the fact that since parties cannot necessarily obviously cannot make binding promises about too much, right? There's only so much you can make binding as a promise, that this could lead to sort of a sense of disillusionment if what you consider to be a priority isn't what they end up making binding, right? Maybe not that party, maybe no party at all ends up making that a binding priority and a binding promise. And potentially, if you feel that it could increase the sense of being left out, of not being represented in politics, etc. It could also mean that, by making certain things binding, you highlight them as priorities and differentiate them from everything else. But ultimately, this turns into elections being, slightly pandering to single issue voters or voters who care only about one or two things, and they want to see those as being binding and ignore at that expense the full range of policies and approach, or the politicians themselves and the skills of the politicians of any party. So it could be highlighting specific issues and making parties more narrow in terms of the options and the approach that they offer to voters and the choices that they offer. The second big stakeholder to look at is politicians and how this would affect politicians and political parties, not just their actions both firstly in campaigning, how would their campaign strategies change, and secondly, their actions once already in office, right? How would they behave as government? I think this can be an area where you can generate a lot of content in this debate, especially if you break it down further into smaller subgroups of stakeholders and become a little bit more specific in terms of the analysis, right? So there are broad claims that you can make that obviously this will force politicians to focus and look into policies and decide which are these policies that they can consider binding and set their priorities. It would literally make them, commit to certain things rather than allowing them to make broad promises that they know they cannot deliver on, right? So I think you can make broad arguments here in proposition about how this addresses populism and sort of the trend of having big promises and big rhetoric, but not actually being able to deliver. But I think there's also sort of more specific groups that you can focus on here, right? So are there specific politicians that have an incentive to make these kind of promises? Is this a particular group within politics that tends to be more populist than others, or is this a broad issue and a broad problem across the spectrum, the political spectrum that you can address here? Would it be the case that, for example, it makes it harder to do this if you are a larger party? Does it affect larger parties that are hoping to be in government in a different way than it does smaller parties? Because, for example, if I'm a smaller party that doesn't expect to get elected, it's probably much easier, or to get elected into government, right? So I expect to get a 3 or 4%, get into parliament, get a few seats, but I don't expect to be in government. Then in that case, for example, it's much easier to make a binding promise because, I sound good, I've made a binding promise, but I know that ultimately I'm not going to be the party in government, and therefore this policy won't in practice ever apply to me, right? So perhaps this gives more power to smaller and opposition and fringe parties than it does to mainstream parties who are competing for not just getting elected, but forming a government, and therefore they would hesitate a lot more. So you could have a situation in which the dynamics between small and large parties are shifting, or the dynamics between more mainstream candidates who again would probably be more cautious with the issues that they choose to be binding on, and politicians who are sort of coming in from the outside, going for more of a moonshot approach of I go all in. If I manage to get it, I do. Otherwise, I was an outsider in the first place, right? Who might be more willing to take this kind of risk because they want to break into getting elected, and that's the biggest barrier for them to cross. So this could affect the different groups differently, right? And I think this can be used from both proposition and opposition in talking about how this shifts the dynamics between more mainstream and fringe parties or candidates, and how this will approach them with more or less caution in each case. and why this can be a good or a bad thing, right? I think proposition can argue that it's a good thing, that it's making mainstream politicians more cautious, that it kind of puts a stop to all parties and all politicians going down the populist route of making empty promises. Whereas I think opposition can argue that this is problematic because it shifts the dynamic into favoring those who can make those promises still without fear of real consequences in the end, while it makes the others unable to compete and restrains them in an unfair way. I think finally here, there's an issue here in terms of how this will play out, right? And I think there's a question of how often would the elections actually get triggered, right? And there's a question of frequency here. I think that two sides probably disagree on this, right? I think proposition would expect that new elections would get triggered very rarely when parties actually fail to deliver on these promises. Whereas I think opposition probably has an incentive in this debate to demonstrate this as something that happens a lot more frequently, and that there's a lot more elections happening as a consequence of this motion, right, and of this model, because parties will inevitably fail to fulfill those promises. I think this is something that both sides can argue. I think frequency, probably, prop has an incentive to show it's less frequent, op that it's more frequent, but ultimately frequency in and of itself is not a winning argument for each side, right? I think both sides need to argue from proposition that this frequency is a good thing. It increases accountability, it increases the pressure on politicians to deliver by their promises, and therefore by extension increases representation so that the voters' interests are actually represented in the policies that governments enact. I think opposition can argue that this frequencies of elections could be problematic. It doesn't really lead to accountability and representation, but rather it increases instability, and it doesn't allow for governments to function, to govern, and to be effective in their role, even when it requires compromises compared to their pre-electoral promises, right? So again, just be careful here. I think this is true of the whole debate, that the two sides very often will agree that something will happen. Yes, possibly more elections than before. Yes, more binding promises than before. But actually talking about whether this is a good or a bad thing is where the impacts play out, both in terms of deciding which policies this would apply to. Secondly, which parties would be more likely to be restrained by this policy, and thirdly, whether this frequency of elections, increased frequency for the possibility of elections, would be something that enhances representation and accountability and makes politics more effective, or whether it's something that increases instability and sort of leads to politicians and political parties being held to impossibly high standards, especially when the context around them changes. So as I said, these are broad ideas to consider. This is why a lot of this is questions, not just content itself. Ideas to consider. You can win this debate by touching on all or a few of those issues. It doesn't have to include everything, but hopefully these are interesting areas that you can explore in order to have more content and more options available to you. Thank you.